Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tomas Delgado, Program Manager with the National Farm to School Network, and we'll be hosting today's NFSN Coffee Chat titled Celebrating Indigenous Foodways and Futures. Before we get started, I would just like to take this time to acknowledge that I have resided and currently am on the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, Piakashaw, the Waya, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Souk, Mascati, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and the Chickasaw Nations. And if you would like, you can go ahead and just share, take this moment to share your acknowledgements in the comments section or chat or however way you're connecting with us today. This particular coffee chat has been curated as part of NFSN's ongoing celebration of Native American Heritage Month. And we have the honor of being joined by two special guests to take part in what we really expect to be an engaging and rich conversation aimed at appreciating Indigenous knowledge, highlighting traditional foodways, and uplifting food sovereignty efforts. So to get us started, I'm going to pass it to my colleague, Mackenzie, to do some framing for the day.
Hey everyone, my name is Mackenzie Martinez and I'm a Programs and Policy Associate for National Farm to School Network. I'm based in Louisiana on the lands of the Osage and people. So today I'd like to first start off by thanking our sponsors. Thank you to National Co-op Grocers for their support of National Farm to School Network. Their support helps us make this coffee chat series possible, so thank you. And I'm going to start off by making a quick introduction of our guest. So today, my colleague and I will be joined by two amazing Indigenous leaders and food systems advocates. I'm so thrilled to not only welcome their knowledge into this space, but to also be able to call them friends. So Cindy Farley serves as a program officer for the Native American Agriculture Fund. NAF is a private charitable trust that provides grants to eligible organizations for business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, and advocacy services to support Native farmers and ranchers. She is a citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and grew up on a cattle ranch on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation in north central South Dakota. Cindy is a first-generation college graduate with a Bachelor of Arts in Indigenous and American Indian Studies with an emphasis in sovereignty from Haskell Indian Nation University. Cindy was also part of the first cohort of Arizona State University's Food Policy and Sustainability Leadership Graduate Certificate Program. Cindy is currently a graduate student at Montana State University, where she is pursuing a Master of Arts in Native American Studies. So welcome, Cindy. So glad to have you here. We're also going to be joined by Mariah Gladstone. Mariah grew up in Northwest Montana. She is the founder of Indigikitchen, an online cooking show dedicated to re-indigenizing our diets using digital media. She graduated from Columbia University with a degree in environmental engineering and returned home where she developed Indigikitchen. Mariah has been recognized as a champion for change through the Center for Native American Youth, a culture of health leader through the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and an MIT Solve Indigenous Communities Fellow. She also serves on the board of FAST, Food Access and Sustainability Team Blackfeet. Mariah is a Sloan Scholar currently completing her master's degree at SUNY ESF through the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment. I'm so excited to have both of you here today, and I will now turn it over to Tomas to get things started.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Yeah, I'm really excited to start this conversation with you, Cindy and Mariah. Just going to hand it off to you to just introduce yourselves and just share a bit about really why you're interested in talking about this particular topic.
All good. Hami takepi iuha chante washte anape chiuzapi washichuya Cindy Farley amachapi wakpa washte oyate hamataha. Hello, my relatives. My name is Cindy Farley. I greet you with a good heart and a handshake. Like Mackenzie said, I'm originally from Eagle Butte, South Dakota, on the Cheyenne River Indian Reservation. Growing up on a cattle ranch and kind of being in this native ag space for the last couple of years with work is, just realizing how important our food systems are, and going back to our, not just our traditional ways, but our modern ways of feeding ourselves as tribal people and communities is just really important to me. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm excited about this conversation.
Okay, nisto na tayo ko umakes to wakaki, no pachtutu sitikiti tapiksakum. My name is Mariah Gladstone. I am from the Blackfeet Nation in Northwest Montana. And I am really excited to be here with you guys today to talk about Indigenous food systems, especially as they relate to farm to school, in part because I think systems and talk about food is such a great vehicle to talk about so many other interconnected things. Food sovereignty is really essential to political sovereignty. And so as we recognize our ability to feed ourselves, we also are able to engage with much larger conversations while also talking about delicious things.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, so I figure we can start early. Would love to just know, what are some of the most memorable early experiences you had related to traditional foods, and maybe thinking about food systems as an actual working system. So yeah, what are some of those early memories related to that?
I'll take it, Cindy. So, I was lucky to grow up in a house where we were encouraged to cook. And I think that was part of my mom's plan to teach me fractions secretly by making me bake a lot. But I also was lucky that my dad and grandpa picked a part of the yard and tilled it up for me and fenced it away from our large dogs and let me garden every year. And so that was always my responsibility, was to plant and take care of the garden. So I would intricately plan out on graph paper every year where my crops would grow. My mom is enrolled Cherokee in Oklahoma, and I remember hearing her tell me no self-respecting Cherokee would ever plant a garden without corn in it. So I made sure I had my corn, and I had all of my plants just all intricately arranged. And I got to experience not only pulling my corn out of the garden, but I got to take my carrots and be munching on my dirt-covered carrots right from the ground, and really kind of understanding where food came from. And then of course, being able to give that to my parents and see it transformed into food. And all of that was of course coupled with wild game meat that my cousins would hunt, and wild rice that we got from trade with Red Lake. I think my dad did performance for the Red Lake Nation and ended up with a 5-gallon bucket full of wild rice. And so we always grew up with wild rice omelets and wild rice pancakes. And so I was really lucky to have a lot of Indigenous foods that were part of my diet growing up.
Thank you.
Yeah, like Mariah said, growing up, I was really fortunate to be raised practicing a lot of my Lakota culture. My mom was really adamant about including me and my siblings in our traditional ceremonies and stuff like that. But also, I have really early memories of going out with my grandma and some of my cousins digging teamsila or wild turnips, and having that experience and knowing our tribal stories, our oral stories about teamsila in general, and how important it is to our people and where it came from. Like Mariah too, my dad and my brother are hunters, so I always got to have like deer meat, I think maybe moose once or twice, elk, different types of fish, stuff like that. So I really consider myself fortunate, and we are cattle ranchers, so I grew up eating our own beef. In a lot of different places it's hard to access stuff like that, not only just because it's become really expensive, because especially during the pandemic, but just getting access to quality good beef is like a 1,500-mile round trip for the cattle sometimes, and I was really lucky to have that. So yeah, it's been really important, going out picking choke cherries, June berries, stuff like that, and harvesting some of our other culturally important foods and roots and stuff like that. So those are some early memories.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. Would love to just know how these early experiences connect with some of your current ventures, and yeah, how do you see these sorts of things sort of playing out to what you all are doing now and what you hope to do in the future?
I'll take this one again. So being exposed to my own culturally important foods growing up, and then in 2016, I think, is whenever I actually met Mariah. It was at the Fertile Grounds 2 conference in Minneapolis, was where I was kind of first exposed on a large scale to the different, culturally important or traditional foods of other tribes. And then the subsequent conferences that I've been able to attend since then, having, the sous chef or Brian Yazzie be able to cook the meals at some of these things is just incredible. And seeing what they do with foods from, the Southwest or the Great Lakes, the Pacific Northwest, the East Coast and the Southeastern parts of the country has really been cool. And it's really opened my eyes and educated me on how important our entire food system is throughout the nation and how they all fit together. Back in the day, our trade routes, a lot of the time, that's how we got salmon in the Great Plains. We didn't obviously have salmon, and that's how buffalo roamed everywhere, and all this other stuff. But it's just really educated me on helping in any way that I can to either further that kind of knowledge or be an ally to my other tribal relatives in supporting their food sovereignty efforts as well. So exposure.
Yeah, I think along with all of that, Cindy mentioned these traditional trade routes and these ways in which, as Indigenous people, we have engaged with foods from outside of our direct geographical region, by being able to share in those food experiences. And we can see documentation of that in archaeological sites and being able to see how far food traveled, because of course, we know that Indigenous people's primary method for preservation was drying, and that made food transportable over long distances. And so it's fun that even though we get to share in like these conference experiences today, we get to, we could theoretically have food overnighted to us from different places in the country. We also recognize that this shared intercultural experience in Indian country has been a part of Indigenous cuisine for a while. And so it's cool to look at that and to be able to experience foods from different places in that way. My dad grew up in Seattle, and so it's funny that some of the foods from the Pacific Northwest have also become ingrained within our family's Indigenous food idea, because the largest concentration of Blackfeet people outside of the reservation is in Seattle, because it's an overnight train ride away. And there were, of course, a lot of migration during World War II and after. And so it's interesting that that has become part of our cultural cuisine. I have family that's married other Indigenous people from the Great Lakes region. And so wild rice has become incorporated into our cultural cuisine, even though in Montana, we don't have salmon or wild rice, but we get that shared experience through people marrying in, through the diaspora, wherever it may be. And so I think that's fun, in addition to all of the shared food sovereignty and conference experiences that we get now too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to just another question that I came up with. What are some of the favorite dishes or food items that maybe outside of like the traditional regions of your communities that have been, like you said, incorporated into your own family traditions, or that you've been able to learn about through conference experiences, or other experiences like that?
So there's a lot of amazing foods from the, into Central America that I think have become important to my own cuisine. Just looking at the indigenous foods like chilies, for example, like tomatoes, these foods that are both delicious nightshades, but also so essential to so many cuisines around the world. And of course, recognizing the indigenous wisdom that has cultivated those foods over centuries and has enabled them to be brought into our kitchens and into our everyday meals. So I think those are things that are often overlooked as indigenous foods. And I think that that's something that can be recognized. I also love looking at foods like amaranth, for example, another really important food in Central America. But I think amaranth is totally underutilized in our cuisine, especially as we look at the varieties of plants that are, very, very similar, that have been grown around the land currently known as the United States. We look at things like lamb's quarter, goosefoot, and pigweed, and all of these varieties of plants very, very similar to amaranth that have been grown not only as wild greens, but also for their seed value, this high protein content seed that can be cooked, boiled down and cooked like a grain. And I think that's something that grows well in so many parts of the country and is just really underutilized. It makes awesome salads, awesome greens, awesome grains, but also you can cook down the grains and turn them into crackers, and you can have so many other fun foods just from this one plant. So I love that. And I love thinking about the different foods that we can grow very easily.
For me, I mean, a few of my family members married people from the Navajo or the Dene Nation. I have a lot of friends from Haskell who are Navajo as well. So I am a little bit biased, and I really love blue cornmeal. That's one of my favorite things. I've used a couple of Mariah's recipes, by the way. Go check those out. Those are awesome. So that's one of, the different tribal foods that I've really come to enjoy and like to include in my own diet, if you will. I also really like wild rice. I have a lot of Anishinaabe adopted relatives and friends and colleagues too. And I am a sucker for any kind of salmon. I really love smoked salmon. Huckleberries, since moving to Montana, Mariah gets it. Huckleberries are awesome. But yeah, there's a lot to name, but just growing up with that kind of stuff. And I try to attempt to try to eat different types of food, especially native foods, just to see what they taste like. I also really love hominy and corn, so those are fun.
Great, yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Mackenzie, are there any sort of traditional foods that you grew up with that you especially hold dear to your heart, or new ones that you've been exposed to that maybe working its way into traditions within your family?
So I think that I definitely resonate with Mariah in that we always had a garden every summer, and that was a lot of access to fresh produce for my family. And thinking about indigenous foods, we would always grow squash and tomatoes and things like that. So looking back on my childhood, those are definitely some of my fondest memories. And yeah, they're really great to think back on, especially being in food systems work now, just thinking about how even as a kid in my yard, just out there picking tomatoes with my mom, that I was so involved in the food system, and especially as it relates to our indigenous food. So yeah, just really great experience with gardening during the childhood and growing a lot of things.
Yeah, thank you. And Mariah, I would love to learn just more about how food is utilized within your venture of Indigication, and sort of what that means for the future of Foodways.
So back at this conference that Cindy and I were at in 2016, there was a lot of talk about access and this need to revitalize Indigenous food systems, make sure that people have access to foods that we've traditionally eaten, both for health as well as culture, but also because we recognize that Indigenous people have been forcibly separated from our traditional food systems. All of that work to rebuild access also needs to come with revitalization of knowledge systems. And we know that if you didn't grow up in the kitchen, starting to pick up recipe books can be really intimidating. And so I decided at that point, almost half as a joke, to launch a cooking show that would teach people how to use traditional Indigenous ingredients. And I started getting set up just with the information that I had and my janky camera and Windows Movie Maker, which is the worst of all video editing software, and started to document the recipes that I knew. I contacted friends from college. I had people send me recipes that they were interested in sharing. And I started building a database of videos that showcased how to create recipes using Indigenous ingredients. I was also really lucky to grow up in the kitchen, and I grew up experimenting a lot with food. So I experimented a lot with Indigenous ingredients as well. Made things that varied from super traditional, made for hundreds of years, to taking traditional ingredients and reimagining them in fun ways in the modern kitchen. Recognized us with ancestral wisdom and 21st century tools. And so all of these things have resulted in, of course, increased production quality over time, but also the ability to create a source of recipes that showcase Indigenous food wisdom and connection to the landscape, while also highlighting things that are great for our health, that are fun ways to connect with our family, to share foods. And if you guys go to indigikitchen.com, there's my shameless self-promotion in there. You guys can see recipes that range from bison and butternut squash lasagna, to white bean coffee cake, to sunflower seed caramel popcorn, all of these really, really fun recipes that are made with the idea that people can start incorporating more Indigenous foods into their diet, but also things that they're able to make when they get home from work at the end of the day.
Great, thank you so much for that. Cindy, where do you see your work with Native American Agriculture Fund sort of fitting into contributing to building up foodways in the future?
Yeah, so like Mackenzie said, we are a private charitable trust. We are a 20-year spend down trust, so with like 18 years and counting. So the time is really up there to get all this funding out. And one of the big things that my former boss Janie Sims Hip and my current CEO Tony Sanger McLaughlin and our entire NAF team actually have contributed to is a report called Reimagining Native Food Systems. I believe I'm really bad at plugging stuff, so Mariah is way better at that, but I believe that's what it is. On our website you can find it, and it really breaks down this regional food hub idea and what it would take in funding, what it could look like, with a good example of where this kind of came from was the Quapaw Nation of Oklahoma has this incredible slaughter and process facility down in Northeast Oklahoma that Mackenzie, Mariah, and I have all had the really great opportunity of seeing firsthand and seeing the work that they've done, and the work now that they've inspired other tribes to do. Since then, a lot of other tribal nations have gone into looking at building and successfully building multi-species slaughter and processing facilities for buffalo or bison, how some people say it, cattle, stuff like that. But I feel like our report on reimagining our native food systems is a great example of what NAF hopes, the kind of impact that we hope to make, and hopefully inspire other partners to come in on this, and tribal nations to get an idea of what this could look like and how successful it can be and how much it could revitalize our communities and feed our people directly. So.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so wanted to touch on a few things, given that we're maybe like a little over a week out from the holiday of Thanksgiving, and wanted to just ask, how do you receive or how do you address that holiday? What are some of the experiences that you had, given that the holiday is really centered around food, really centered around gathering? It's one that is really framed for American youth as being one of a kind of a joyous celebration between settlers and Native people. Would love to just kind of get an open-ended response of how you receive the holiday and what you what you believe the future of that holiday should hold.
Yeah, I'll jump in. So in Montana, we're very, very lucky that we have a state constitutional mandate for Montana Indian education for all. So I was really lucky that I didn't grow up with this fake narrative of happy celebrations. And, rather we recognize Thanksgiving as a holiday that was established during the Civil War to bring a sense of unity to the North and the South. And of course, there was a narrative that was established alongside that. But if you look at traditional Indigenous cultural ceremonies, many agricultural communities had similar harvest celebrations in which we are able to express gratitude and give respect to the earth for the gifts of the harvest, and to be able to sit down and celebrate all of that with our family and our friends. And that has been part of many Indigenous cultures for long before anyone arrived from half a world away. And so, I can say that in my own family, we often have gatherings around the time, and it doesn't involve any type of Pilgrim and Indian story or fake paper headdresses or whatever people do. But it is a time that we can show gratitude and honor the changing of the seasons and the harvests of the earth. And especially since so many things that are traditionally incorporated as part of these meals have come from Indigenous origins, whether that is turkeys or I was going to say wild rice, because wild rice is always at my Thanksgivings, even if it's not yours personally. But potatoes, of course, are from South America. We know all these different types of squash are part of our traditional foods. Green beans, we look at all of these different Indigenous foods. Pecan pies, though you can also make sunflower seed pies, by the way. Pumpkins, everything else. So I look at this as a time to really honor Indigenous foods like cranberries. I'm just going to keep listing Indigenous foods throughout this conversation. But also, there is kind of this, I don't know, I'd say a lot of Native people have this voice in the back of our heads. It's like, are you going to celebrate this colonial holiday? I would say that Thanksgiving is stealing ideas from Indigenous people, because we were having these wonderful harvest celebrations with our foods long before. But if you want to acknowledge that traumatic history more aggressively, you can always have a thanks-taking feast or a thanks but no Thanksgiving dinner. This is what we did when I was in college, just get real radical, but still eat delicious food together and celebrate awesome Indigenous meals.
Mariah, you crack me up. Yeah, so like Mariah, I obviously grew up partaking in Thanksgiving meals, going over to different families, getting together, and like a lot of Native families, I have a big family on all sides, my mom and my dad, and then their extended families. So we always grew up, seeing our grandparents and our great grandparents and our relatives that we didn't get to see for, a couple months at a time, or people who don't live quite so close throughout the rest of the year. And growing up, I want to say I don't really remember too much. I know that we did like Thanksgiving activities at school. I'm pretty sure we didn't wear headdresses or make stuff like that. But there is always the story about the Pilgrims and the Indians and that stuff. But these days I really like to think of it as coming together. Like Mariah said, we did this long before anybody came over, celebrating our families and our extended families through food. And that's our way of showing that we care and that we love somebody, is offering them food. And so now seeing all this stuff on social media of people wearing fake headdresses and doing that whole tomahawk weird motion thing, it does suck, because it is a little degrading. And I try not to think too much about that, but I think about my nieces and nephews and my younger relatives growing up and seeing that. But I also think the difference between when I was growing up until now and when they're growing up, that they mostly, I'd like to think more people are held accountable for being ignorant, or giving them the opportunity to come forward and take that accountability and say, I made a mistake and I want to fix it, and be an ally. And I just hope people look past all of that fake stereotypical stuff and truly try to educate themselves, because the different cultures around this nation and beyond have incredible celebrations of food and harvest and stuff like that people can respect and or partake in a more respectful way. So just being an ally and educating yourself. But I still like to eat food. So
Thank you so much for that. In the vein of being a good ally, how do you think those of us who are interested in addressing the history of the holiday and what a future of the holiday could look like, how do you think sort of reaching atonement and reframing the holiday, how do you think it would look like? What are some maybe suggestions that you would have for those who may want to change tradition around that holiday?
So when I was about 2 years old, we were over at one of my non-native family members' houses for Thanksgiving dinner, and she had tiny like porcelain pilgrims set up on the mantle. And I was 2, so I pointed at them and said, "Look, Mom, illegal aliens." And I would not recommend doing that because it made everything very uncomfortable, but also I was 2. So I think there are much better ways of reframing the holiday without antagonizing family members. But also I think that there are ways of showing gratitude and connecting with landscapes, connecting with the land that you're on. I think if we look at wherever we are on this continent or other continents, to be able to take a walk outside the day before your harvest celebration, learn more about the plants that are there, whatever other beings inhabit that same space as you, and perhaps they're native plants, perhaps they're ornamental plants, whatever it is that is sharing that space with you, find something edible. There are hundreds of thousands of edible plants that can be incorporated into the next day's meals, whether that's incorporating a pine needle tea to sip on while you prepare dinner, whether you're lucky enough to have some berries that you've already picked stored in the freezer and you can make into a pie, whatever, to be able to share in that connection with your landscape. Of course, if you are able to source any of your ingredients from local farmers or local community members, whether that's actually processing a pie pumpkin to make your pumpkin pies, or if you're lucky enough to have someone that raises turkeys, or someone in your family that hunts and wants to share wild game for that meal, whatever it may be. I think that not only do local foods and Indigenous foods help us take care of our bodies and feed ourselves good food through that way that's nutritionally sound, but also when we eat from the land and we connect with the land in that way, we start to understand a little bit more about where our responsibility is to taking care of those spaces where our food comes from as well. There's a reciprocity that's inherently involved with learning about and knowing exactly where your food comes from. And so it's not just about our food taking care of us, but it's about us taking care of our food and where our food comes from as well. And I think when we have that responsibility to the land, we also in turn help honor Indigenous people that have been the caretakers of the land for thousands of years. And I think when everyone gains that little bit of respect and responsibility, it helps contribute overall to the good. And that, of course, is part of this holiday of gratitude and celebration.
So all of what Mariah said, I think, trying to source local for your meal in general is just a really great way to, give back to your community. Those people who, I have cattle ranchers, obviously my family, I've said that a lot, but we're ranchers, and that's a lot of our livelihoods. And the same for, people who raise turkeys or, raise this produce like pumpkin squash, whatever, you're supporting their family and you're supporting their livelihoods. Like Mariah said, buying local is just a really good thing. But the part about being an ally, I suppose, educating yourself, because the United States and our governments and our states, whatever, can only do so much. And a lot of this change happens on the local and the community level. And I think, as much as it's still helpful to, be an advocate for tribal food producers in general as a whole, and tribal ag, educating yourself and being aware of the different opportunities and the different organizations who are fighting to, change that stereotype. Illuminatives comes to mind when I think of, people trying to, change that stereotype and doing a lot of really great work in that arena. Following them on social media, they have a lot of really great resources. The Intertribal Agriculture Council, NAF, IndigiKitchen, all these different really great organizations, being aware of them, contributing to them if you can in any ways, but just adding on to what Mariah said.
Yeah, thank you. Lots of really great points there. And you had named a lot of organizations that are really within their mission seeking out to increase just native foodways and build up capacity for them to happen. And it really brings us just to a question of, what does food sovereignty mean to you and to your community within the context of many of these organizations and groups that are doing work day in and day out for them?
So I always define food sovereignty, so I can use the textbook definition, or the one defined by La Via Campesina, which is, of course, food sovereignty is the right of people to healthy, affordable, culturally appropriate food harvested through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, right? It's this big definition. I normally think of as having like these four main important parts. But really, for my community, it goes deeper, because food sovereignty is part of our political sovereignty. I've heard Winona LaDuke say, how can we call ourselves sovereign if we can't feed ourselves? And when our bison were taken and hunted nearly to extinction, the Blackfeet people lost in many ways our ability to feed ourselves. And of course, we were put onto a system of government rations, as was intended, so that we would not be able to fight back against the government, against settler expansion into our lands on the Northwestern Plains. And one winter, the rations weren't arriving. They didn't come on time, or they came late and rotten, and a quarter of our population starved to death. And in the following years, our leaders negotiated to sell parts of our remaining reservation lands, including the land behind me in my picture, which is actually taken from the border of the reservation looking towards the Continental Divide, because the mountains were taken from us as part of this. There was thoughts that there might be gold in the mountains. And so the area that's the eastern half of Glacier National Park was sold by the Blackfeet people so that we would have the money to buy food for the children, so we would never have to suffer that starvation again. And so that land includes the summit of Chief Mountain, which is our most sacred mountain peak. And so for food sovereignty, that ability to feed ourselves means that we have the ability to control our own destiny. It means that we have the ability to negotiate from a point of strength. And, for me, I see the incredible beauty and power of those mountains. And as a descendant, as someone that is here because our leaders negotiated for this land in exchange for our lives, in exchange for food, so that we would have descendants and a future. There is a lot of responsibility that comes with that, but also that is how our ancestors viewed us as the future generations. And so food sovereignty comes not just with delicious food, but it also comes with that bigger story. And so that's what food sovereignty means to me. It's about our future and our identity as a nation and our people.
Yeah, thank you so much for that really powerful framing and definition. There was one comment that came to us. Just would like you to just repeat the definition, of food sovereignty and where you got it from.
Yeah, you can look up La Via Campesina, which is the peasants movement. The United Nations also uses the same definition. It is the right of people to healthy, affordable, culturally appropriate food harvested through ecologically sound and sustainable methods. And if you want to go a step further, the right to govern those systems that regulate those. So as sovereign nations, that's the ability to write our own food and agricultural codes. It's the ability to regulate food safety and pesticide use and everything else.
Thank you so much for that.
I'll hop on in. Hard to follow Mariah. She's so good with words. Sometimes they escape me, but food sovereignty to me, like Mariah said, Winona LaDuke, Ross Racine, Zach Duchenal, a lot of people, Janie Hip, have made the comment, how can we be truly sovereign if we can't feed ourselves? And going back to, the buffalo were and are still a really important part of Lakota culture. And like Mariah said, when the federal government went and tried to destroy that food system and almost succeeded, there's a lot of years of struggle relying on survival foods. As much as I love fry bread and all that other stuff, commods are survival foods, and having access to those is really important for people who don't have access to a lot of other foods. But the background of those and what they do to our bodies, and in turn our entire health, mental health, spiritual, physical, emotional, our relationships to our land and our culture, it's really hard to think that those are still good for us. So food sovereignty it's important because bringing the buffalo back. The buffalo are our brother sister nation, the Teoyate in Lakota, and seeing all of the different tribal entities and nonprofits and organizations around the country, but closer to home for me, bringing back those buffalo herds and seeing the really great impact that that's had on just them coming back, that uplifting and that inspiration that they are on their way back, kind of gives me hope that we're on our way back to coming back to not only our cultural not only our cultural values and practices, but it comes from our health comes from within and what we put in our bodies, and that helps us carry out our daily tasks, and it's important to our relationships. Like I said, the way you show somebody that you love them or care about them or that they're welcome is you feed them. You show up to an auntie's house or your grandma's house, and the first thing that they want to do is like, oh, are you hungry? My girl, are you hungry? And I'm always like, yeah, please. So being able to do that on an entire community or tribal level is just, it's an important thing that I think we need to get back to, because like Mariah said, it's a political, it's everything. Like food goes back to everything. Our livelihoods, being able to conduct ourselves as a sovereign nation and exercise those treaty rights is important, and it all goes back to food. So being able to do that is a really empowering act that we need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of brings us to my next question. How do you see a practice like farm to school fitting into this effort of greater food sovereignty and just bringing back, sorry, my dog's how do you see a practice and a model like farm to school really emboldening and strengthening these efforts?
The different examples of National Farm to School Network working in tribal communities are really cool. During one of the youth summits that I was able to attend, one of the specific ones that was highlighted was with the Chickasaw Nation, which I thought was really cool. Growing up, I'd never heard of National Farm to School. And I feel like, partnering with the different tribal entities and organizations and tribal producers is, an incredible opportunity to not only bring in, the real history or educating rather than the stereotypical stuff that comes to mind, especially during Thanksgiving, I suppose. But again, just contributing to that local economy and that tribal economy and bringing in opportunities to strengthen that, I feel like is a wonderful thing, and more people should look into.
So I recently worked with the Montana Farm to School organization, housed at Montana State University, to add bison or buffalo or eni or tatanka or whatever we're calling it to our Harvest of the Month materials. These materials that are turned out into school districts that showcase different agricultural products from the state every month. And beef has been part of the materials for a while. But our OG Harvest of the Month, as this sacred animal of which millions inhabited the plains, wasn't part of the material yet. And so that's something we were really excited to do, because we got to showcase this incredible food, both for its nutritional value, but also for the cultural importance that it's had for so many people on the plains. And as part of those materials, we also made sure that they included information. Our video that is turned out into school includes speakers from every nation in Montana saying their word for that animal in their language, bison, bison. or scientific name. And we got to showcase that along with the many uses of bison, both for food and shelter and clothing and tools. And we got to talk about the history of bison on the landscape and the damage that was done. And then we got to show awesome recipes to incorporate buffalo into school lunch programs. And so that was something that was really cool that helped work with the farm to school program in Montana, but also just, to continue working with schools both on and off reservation to incorporate more foods into our, more local foods into our school lunch program, more indigenous foods into our school lunch program. I'm currently working on completing a toolkit, working with No Kid Hungry actually, to create a toolkit for incorporating more indigenous foods into school lunch programs. And then working with the American Indian Foods Program at the Intertribal Agricultural Council to work on procurement for that. So looking at how we source from indigenous producers, how we navigate the USDA and their nutritional requirements for programs in school lunches. How do you count wild rice in your meals? How do you do all of those things? So I'm actually, more shameless pitches, doing a cooking demonstration with the Farm to School program through First Nations Development Institute tomorrow, where we get to make wild rice pilaf live on camera. So that's open to anyone. If they want to register, they can find that link in the First Nations Development Institute thing. But we get to talk about farm to school and how to incorporate more indigenous ingredients as part of that, and really showcase some cool foods, and also something that's like hands down my favorite dish to bring to harvest celebrations. There's a lot of fun things that could be done, but I think learning more about the indigenous foods from your region, connecting with local farmers that are growing foods that grow well in your region traditionally, and also if you're lucky enough to connect with indigenous producers, to be able to do that and find out how to incorporate that into meals as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. So as we're coming to close, just wanted to give you an opportunity to share any sort of thoughts that, or ideas, or just anything about the work that you all are doing that you didn't get to cover in our discussion today. So wanted to hand it back to you if there's anything else you wanted to share with our audience. Yeah.
I will try to take note from Mariah and doing some shameless plugs. I'm very bad at it, like we've seen, but I just really encourage people to look into these different organizations that we've named, the Intertribal Agriculture Council, First Nations Development Institute, Indigenous Food and Ag Initiative out of Arkansas, NAF. We have a lot of really great resources and educational resources that help people, bridge that gap. Very welcoming. We really try to include everybody because we all live on the same planet and in these same communities. And, we should all be aware of what's going on, but also, different funding opportunities for Native producers and Native organizations. There's just a lot of really cool partnerships that can go on. So I just highly encourage people to look into those and be an ally or support anywhere you can.
Thank you for that.
Cindy just shouted out a whole bunch of awesome organizations. So I'm just going to shout out a whole bunch of awesome Indigenous chefs. Go find their cookbooks. So obviously Sean Sherman, the sous chef, SAOUX, has a cookbook. Valerie Seacrest came out with a cookbook, which is awesome. Tashia Hart came out with a cookbook recently, which is like all about wild rice. So I'm stoked to dive into that. Marty Reinhardt of the Decolonizing Diet Project has a cookbook that's actually available through Northern Michigan University, I think. There are other cookbooks, including I think Native Harvests. I'm just so excited because it seems like every week more natives are coming out with cookbooks, which is high quality, and I need to dive into them more. And no, I don't have a cookbook. I have to finish my master's.
I was gonna say, waiting for yours, Mariah.
I was like, people always ask me that, and I'm like, I have a website where you can get recipes for free there. follow it. Okay, I'm done being shameless now. Yeah. I'm not like this in real life.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Cindy and Mariah, for the time and all of your ideas, thoughts. We had a really great discussion. And for those of you watching, please look into their work at Native American Agriculture Fund and the Digi Kitchen. In closing, we just want to remind everyone that's viewing, you can follow National Farm to School Network's social media channels, as well as our e-newsletter to stay up to date on next month's coffee chat, as well as other conversations and programs that we're offering. So we really appreciate your feedback, and we welcome just any kind of suggestions or partnerships that you believe that we should be focusing on. But again, thank you to our guest today. And yeah, we will hope to have a conversation like this in the future.